Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by NDIS Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Welcome back to another episode of the NDIS Property Australia podcast. Today we're here with Emelitta and Dante, and we're talking about SDA funding for participants. Take it away, Em.
Thank you so much. So today we're here with Dante from Adapt Housing. So Dante, do you want to introduce yourself and let us know what your role is at Adapt, what you do, what you guys are all about?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Emelitta, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I suppose a little bit about Adapt Housing. So we're an SDA provider, so we're based here in Brisbane, and my role is investor relations. So I work closely with investors, as well as talking, I suppose, support coordinators and participants to help find a suitable housing solution, and that coincides one another between the investors and the participants to ensure that we can come to a suitable arrangement for all parties.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right. Thank you for that. And I think today, what we'll talk about today is we'll talk about funding and how participants get their funding, because I think that is a really important conversation to have for, maybe future participants of the NDIS SDA scheme, but also for the investors and other peers in the NDIS community to actually understand the process of how this works. So yeah, maybe we can start with you talking us through the process of how a participant acquires their funding.
Yeah, of course. So it's a long process to get SDA in their plan. So initially, for a participant to be eligible for SDA, they need to be a part of the NDIS and the National Disability Insurance Scheme, I suppose. So that's the first step, and that's the biggest thing. From there, what they need is an OT or an occupational therapist to do a comprehensive assessment to determine the eligibility for SDA. So to be eligible for SDA, one of the biggest rules is you need 6 or more interventions a day, as well as be deemed as having high needs. So an intervention could be something as simple as needing help getting dressed, cooking dinner, help going to the toilet. So you'll see 6 can add up really, really quickly. But along with that OT report, it coincides with what we call a housing assessment report. So this is done by the likes of people such as Simone Burley, Greg Barry, and Robert Northcott. They're 3 that are really big in this space and who really, really in-depth and efficient sort of represent. All this documentation, along with other bits and pieces, is submitted to the NDIA for the consideration and the application of SDA in their plans. But this can take 6 to 9 months, so it is quite a long process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow. I think a lot of people don't actually know what SDA is, and they don't actually know that it's something that's different from the overall NDIS scheme. So yeah, maybe we could just clarify, what is SDA and how is it different? Like, what's the difference between somebody who just has NDIS funding and has SDA funding?
Yeah, so I suppose SDA being that special line item in an NDIS plan. So SDA is the accommodation, so specialist disability accommodation for those who need specialised housing solutions. And these are people across the 4 categories, obviously, as probably mentioned earlier, is improved livability, fully accessible, high physical support, and robust. And, this specialised housing is to assist with the delivery of supports for those with, I suppose, the 2 being extreme functional impairment or very high support needs. So only about 6% of participants who have NDIS funding are actually eligible for SDA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks so much for clarifying that. So you mentioned that it is a bit of a process to get this SDA funding, that, they firstly have to be approved for the NDIS, which can take, maybe up to 3 months. And then the SDA approval process can take, did you say 6 to 9 months? Is that what you said?
Yeah, it can vary case by case. We've heard of cases or taking longer. We've heard of others that are done within days, if not weeks. It's really a case by case based on the complexity of it.
Yeah. Okay. And what gets taken into consideration during this process? What issues may they run into?
So I suppose it's a difficult one in the sense that participants have to identify goals. The biggest driving force behind getting SDA is what their goals are and what they wish to achieve out of having SDA in their plan. So, for a lot of people, getting SDA means it gives them the ability to move out of their parents' home and live a bit more independently, or, they've got a family and they're in unsuitable accommodation. They might be in a Department of Housing, or they might be just a regular rental, and, the participant in conversation is actually, wheelchair bound, and the property they're in, it's got steps and it's gradients and it's unsuitable. So we hear a lot of stories of participants looking for properties and going through the SDA process just in trying to find accommodation and a forever home that's suitable to them and their needs. So it's quite complex, and we've heard stories of participants being knocked back of the appropriate funding. They've been funded to share rather than independent funding because that's what the NDIS deem. And it's quite critical, that housing report that's done by an SDA report writer. These reports should be anywhere between 90 to 100 pages, really. And we see those, and they're in depth, and they're very good in justifying the goals and the needs of these participants. But then we've seen others that aren't quite as sufficient in evidence to support, and they're the ones that we're seeing that unfortunately just aren't getting that correct funding amount. However, this doesn't prevent them from getting that. There's avenues such as NS 100 or the AAT, which is an independent organisation that allows these participants to fight and appeal their funding amount to get what they deem is the appropriate funding amount. Because the scheme and the NDIS and the SDA, it's all about choice and control. So these participants want to be able to integrate in society and live a wholesome life, but to do so, they need that choice and control. So it's complex.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that there's this housing report that gets done, and that can really impact this whole process of applying for this SDA funding. And you mentioned that if they do get, for lack of a better word, knocked back, or perhaps they don't get the level of funding that they want, they have options. Is that the tribunal? Those options that you mentioned, those independent options, Dante?
Yeah, so there's different avenues, and I suppose one of the most prominent at the moment is the tribunal. Participants are, being given their funding amount. It might be a shared funding, 1 to 3, and in this scenario, that it could be a father who has a wife and 2 children, a dog, and the NDIA have turned around. Well, okay, we're only going to fund you to live in a shared house with 2 other strangers you've never met. So they're the kind of stories that you hear of, and these participants are the ones that are going back and fighting that, and saying, well, listen, this is my situation, this is what I wanted, and this is what you give me. How is this choice and control? So there has been a lot of pushback, but those who really persevere and stick at it are getting the outcome that they wish. But again, not only is it 6 to 9 months to get SDA in plans, but for these participants who are going back and appealing their funding, it's taking upwards of 12 months on top of that. So it is really, really strenuous on these participants, and it's awful to think about. And that's why we say those who persevere do get the outcome, but it's just to have that drive and the energy to be able to stick it out for such long periods of time. It's hard.
Yes. Yeah, I can imagine. I've got chills as you're saying that now, actually. And look, this is, for those listening, this is part 1 of a 2-part podcast. And Dante and I will be going deeper into a case study that actually goes through that process of a participant acquiring funding that wasn't appropriate for them. So more on that in the next episode. So thank you for that, Dante. Now, for those who don't know, how does the funding actually work? Can you give an example or explain, the different options that somebody might go through? Like, I know that there's a chart with different SDA funding outcomes. Can you shed light to that? Give us an example, just to give people an idea.
Yeah, of course. So I suppose, in a way you look at it, that price guide you talk about. So it's basically, it outlines based on the different funding amounts that a participant could be approved for. So on that, there are 84 different combinations. Wow. So out of there, if I just pull one out of the 84, you'll have someone who's funded for high physical support to live house to residence. So pretty much stating that you're being funded, you're deemed high physical support. So you're most likely to be someone who's reliant upon a wheelchair, or it's a degenerative condition like MS, so you'll require automated technology, ceiling hoists. So that's someone who's deemed high physical support. But you're being told that you have to live in a house with live in a house with yourself and someone else. So that funding amount, for example, is $44,992. So that's the annual income for that funding item or line item with OOA. So OOA is on-site overnight accommodation, which is it's an additional room that is where a carer or the supports will most likely set up an office and live. So it's that in-house care that the participants might need because, as mentioned, to be eligible for SDA, you need that high level of care and needs. So a bit extra funding is given from an OOA. The difference between them, it varies because there's 2 line items per design category. One's with OOA funding and one without. So, this sort of stuff we could go on and get right down to the nitty-gritty for the next hour or two. But, I'll keep it brief at a top level. But, yeah, the funding guide's definitely, it's almost a whole other conversation how it works. But, yeah, so that's, I suppose, an example of one of the line items. But it then goes into a coinciding location factor price guide, which works in hand with it. So you build a house for 2 residents that are for high physical support participants in, let's just say, South Brisbane sort of region. So from there, there's another table, another chart that outlines a location factor. That location factor takes into consideration what the funding amount and adjusts it based on that location factor. So just trying to have a look here, South Brisbane, as mentioned, for a house 2 residents, it's got a location factor of 0.98, which means you're pretty much that 44,000 I mentioned earlier is multiplied by that 0.98, and that's your true annual SDA value of income on a gross level.
Yeah. So what you're saying is there's a certain amount that people get approved for based off this application process, and then there is a location factor that's applied for wherever the person chooses to live, wherever there's suitable accommodation for them there. Yeah. And so the thing is that even though, let's say, the data says that there is, X amount of fully accessible participants living in a certain area, those fully accessible participants are going to have a different level of funding based off what their SDA, what they were approved for SDA, right? So there's more to it than just, okay, there's 10 participants in, I'm just making up things right now, South Brisbane, because that was the example you used. There's 10 participants in South Brisbane that are of a fully accessible category. I'm just making up figures just for the example. And those 10 participants could have any of those options. So they might be approved for
any of the 84.
Any of the 84. Yeah, wow. So there is a lot more that goes into it. So I think let's talk about an example. So let's say I am an investor and I've just purchased a 1-bedroom apartment. Okay. Let's say a 1-bedroom high physical support built apartment. Now, there's a common misconception that means that a person will get, if a high physical support person moves in, that automatically they would get the figure on that price guide that states 1-bedroom apartment. So did you want to shed some light to that?
Sure. So I suppose there's a few different elements to consider when looking at that. So say you've bought an off-the-plan 1-bedroom apartment in a multi-residential high-rise apartment. It's in a great location. Let's say it's, Wollongabba. However, what you got to consider is, so you've paid the money, you've retrofitted it to meet high physical support standards. That's great. You've also got to consider that in order to be eligible for that OOA funding amount, which is the higher of the 2 line items between the with and without, you actually need a second apartment to be able to claim that OOA funding. So in a house, it can be an additional room within. However, in an apartment, it has to be an additional apartment. So it works on what they call a concierge model. So regardless if it's one apartment being serviced or if it's 10, and an additional apartment needs to be designated for the OOA. So all of a sudden, you purchasing 1 unit, that's great. You can still claim your SDA funds, but it's significantly less than, I suppose, what you may perceive. So that's one, I suppose, of the elements to consider. The other is you may not actually get necessarily that highest funded participant. So when registered, the dwelling is registered for one amount. So it's registered for what it's been built to. However, you can apply still all other 83 funding amounts to that unit. So that's where you can use the price guide quite flexibly. So let's just say that one bedroom's funded, or so has an SDA value of 91,000 before location factor. That's just the value that it's being registered as. We can then use the price guide and go, all right, this participant actually has 69,000, which is fully accessible for a one bedroom apartment. And that's where we can talk with investors and we can, I suppose, in a way, negotiate or come to terms that they can be accepted, that participant on that level of funding. It doesn't have to be just that highest funding amount. We can be flexible, and so can the investor as to who we accept in that dwelling. It doesn't have to be that exact amount that it's registered for. And that's what we're finding. Nationally, on average, it's about 1.4 participants per dwelling moving in. And the average funding amount, I would say, not using data, would be around that 41 to 60 mark. At the moment is where we're sort of seeing the funding amounts coming through. Not a lot of one-to-ones. Again, on part 2, I'm sure we'll delve into a bit deeper of what's just happened in terms of a turnaround. But at the moment, it's not a lot of one-to-one fundings being approved, which, it's sad. And these participants, there's a lot going through the process of fighting that. But the current market conditions, that's what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that there's so much to go into with, the participant funding, and then also from the investor perspective, what they can expect if they purchase, any sort of investment property, what the potential is. And it's always worth a conversation around. Yeah, it's always worth a conversation. We're just scraping the surface in this particular conversation. So there's just so much more. Suppose there's a couple more questions that that come up in conversation. So around funding, around participants, etc. So one of the things that some investors have said to me is, who gets to choose who actually lives in the property? How does that process work? Do you choose it? Does the NDIS choose it? Do the investors choose it? Who chooses who actually moves into a property?
Yeah, good question. So there's a lot of parties involved in the SDA that you'll come to realize very quickly, as we touched on earlier, not just your report writer and your occupational therapist. There's also what we call support coordinators, plan managers, SIL providers, SIL standing for supported independent living. So they're the ones that provide the day-to-day care. You've got public guardians, you've got family members, you've got obviously your SDA provider. There is so many different parties involved in this space and this process of moving participants into their forever home. But when it comes down to the funding amount, so the NDIA, the only role they really play in it is they allocate a funding amount and say, here is your SDA funding amount. Let's just say high physical sport with OOA, house 2 residents, to live in South Brisbane. And that'll be a value of, again, pulling number out of 42,000 or so. With that 42,000 now, the participants told to go find an accommodation that's best suited to them with that funding amount. Obviously, it's quite low, and that funding amount, they've indicated that that's to be used in a house setting with 2 or 3 other residents. However, where we can get flexible is, a participant might approach an SDA provider like Adapt and say, hey, I've been funded for this amount. I'd really love to live in South Brisbane. That's where all my allied health services are. It's where my family is, all that. Have you got anything available? And let's just say there's a small villa development being undertaken in South Brisbane. We go to the investor and say, hey, I understand that you're building this 4-pack of villas that are for an SDA value of 55,000. However, we've got a participant who's got 42,000. Are you happy to accept them? So we always have that conversation with an investor prior to, we always approach the investor with the participant's funding amount just to ensure that, they're happy with them to move in on that amount and the participant's happy to live there. So it's all about transparency between all the parties to ensure that everyone's kept happy. Unfortunately, there are some hard conversations where a participant with 41 might want to live in this apartment that's got a value of, 70 or 80,000. And sometimes it doesn't work out well. It's really, really hard to have those conversations, but it's just all about that openness and transparency between all the parties to come to an agreement. So pretty much in short answer, we don't decide. It is end of the day up to the investor as to whether or not they're happy for them to live in their property.
Yeah, understood. Thank you for clarifying that. All right. Well, is there anything else that you could think of? Any last parting words of wisdom?
Not really. I suppose, as you said, we've really just touched on the surface, and we're always open to have these conversations with investors if they have any further clarifying comments or questions they might need from a SDA provider. More than happy to run through it with them, because I know obviously it's a lot to think about. It's a lot to get your head around. So we're always more than happy to answer any questions that may be. Yeah, I suppose that's all I've really got from my end.
Great.
So maybe any other questions that have just popped into your head?
I mean, not yet, but I know that we are doing episode 2, which is going to be a case study on, funding outcomes. So the application process outcomes, and then going through that tribunal process of, appealing for a different funding amount. So we'll go into that in the next episode, which I'm really, really looking forward to. But yeah, I think that this has been really helpful information, Dante, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I know that this is going to be a really insightful and beneficial conversation for investors and participants that want to apply for the SDA to listen to. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Like I said, look forward to the second one.
Great. Thanks, Dante.
Thanks, Emelitta.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.